Mr. Speaker, sir, it's an honor to be here this evening. You may not realize it, but I'm actually wearing makeup right now. But as I pointed out to the people in the room, the hair is real. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure we've all had the experience of having been told something by someone who is a moral superior to us and not having liked that thing, Mr. Speaker. And yet, in the end, having realized that they were right and we were wrong. Ladies and gentlemen, we believe that the same way parenting is not always about children and parents being friends, Mr. Speaker, but it is a relationship of authority. We believe that similarly, in the context of the classroom, it is not always fundamental that the two individuals be treated equally. We do believe that it is necessary under certain circumstances for there to be corporal punishment. Let me explain the model we stand for, Mr. Speaker. We believe that this should be mandated in both public and private schools, Mr. Speaker. We believe that it should only be administered to children between the ages of 4 and 12, Mr. Speaker, never under if they're in a preschool setting, never over 12 if they're in a high school setting. Obviously, no thank you, there can't be any permanent damage. We can't be scarring these children or maiming them for life, only paddling them on the backside, Mr. Speaker. We think that that should be done, however, with a paddle, Mr. Speaker, not the hand, and we believe that that should be administered by someone other than the teacher, Mr. Speaker. We also believe that that should be done in a separate room so that the children don't have to suffer the punishment. Mr. Speaker. And we believe that it should be overseen by medical staff, whether it be the nurse for Singaporean precision here. And finally, obviously it's necessary that a report be filed in each case describing the incident that led up to the punishment, how the punishment was administered, and so on and so forth. So now, in every excruciating detail, ladies and gentlemen, what need do we see for this problem? Secondly, why do we believe it will work? And thirdly, why will nothing else do the trick? Eric's going to talk about some of the legal stuff that we love to throw into debates. The pressing social need, ladies and gentlemen, is the following. We see that there's growing classroom size, Mr. Speaker, making children and the classroom generally more difficult to control. We see that because of that, I'll take you in a moment, sir, we see that because of that, many teachers are now leaving the profession, especially in the areas where we need them most, in the inner cities and in rural areas where the children are most difficult to control. Go ahead.
Ladies and gentlemen, we would argue that state sanctions violence against children just because the government isn't willing to pay the money to have smaller class sizes isn't a good enough reason.
But in the face of that reality, ladies and gentlemen, if we can address this harm through a minimal impairment of the children's rights, we believe it's justified. Mr. Speaker, I, of anyone at this tournament, love to get up and say cost doesn't matter, it's all about the principle, but there are certain circumstances where you have to take that into consideration. Moreover, irrespective of classroom size, the violence against teachers is driving them out of the classroom. Even in places where classroom size is very small, such as in northern Canada, in the Innu communities, we see that there is in fact violence perpetrated by the children against the teachers, and they have no recourse against that. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, we observe that in the United States of America, for example, there's a growing rate of violence against teachers, or the threat of violence. There was a fascinating case in California in which a young boy threatened his teacher with a false arm, Mr. Speaker. Because that child was under the age of 12, Mr. Speaker, we can't criminally sanction them. Similarly, you can't use corporal punishment on them, so you have no recourse, and that teacher eventually quit. No thank you. So if we can address this harm, Mr. Speaker, through corporal punishment, we believe we should do it. We believe it will work for the following reasons, Mr. Speaker. We believe that children between the ages of 4 and 12 don't reason morally on the same level as adults do, Mr. Speaker. We believe that it's not possible to explain to little Billy what's wrong with their actions. No, thank you. We believe that it is necessary under some circumstances to use a more visceral, Mr. Speaker, a simpler, but a certainly more understood by the minds of these children method to correct their behavior. No, thank you. That is why, Mr. Speaker, we give parents that right, because we recognize that sometimes you can't always explain to children why their actions are wrong, and you need to demonstrate a little more discipline. No, thank you. Secondly, we'd like to talk about the psychology of punishment, because we observe, Mr. Speaker, that in order to be able to alter the behavior of an individual, the consequences of their action must be felt immediately, Mr. Speaker. This is a sort of Pavlovian scenario. You have a reward cycle, Mr. Speaker, or you have a punishment cycle. There must be a cause and effect relationship between the action that brings about the punishment and the punishment. Thus, Mr. Speaker, we believe that there are certain actions in the classroom that are so severe, I'll take you in a moment, madam, that require immediate punishment in the school context. We can't wait for the child to get home and be spanked by their parent, Mr. Speaker, because by then they've forgotten what it was they did at school, and therefore the spanking just seems like abuse, not a corrective that is likely to change their behavior.
But sir, none of this explains why you need to use corporal punishment rather than the myriad of other options, especially if they're so behaviorally disturbed. We don't feel a light smack with a paddle is going to deal with the boy.
Well, it ain't going to be that light. Aside from that, we don't believe that the other alternatives are working. We believe that current penalties are not sufficient. We observe that the sanctions of lowering grades, Mr. Speaker, and this is in fact my third area of analysis, the sanctions of lowering grades, Mr. Speaker, or of social pressure are not enough to change behavior. That's why we have a rise in violence, Mr. Speaker. First, the other thing is, Mr. Speaker, we need to have increasing severity of penalties to deal with the repeat offenders. Right now, Mr. Speaker, all we can do is expel them from school, Mr. Speaker. We don't think that's a very good solution because they end up being at home, getting involved in drug addiction, hanging out with other children who've been expelled, Mr. Speaker. We'd rather keep them in the school, Mr. Speaker. And so if this more severe penalty allows us to do that, we believe it's a good thing. The second thing is, Mr. Speaker, we believe that emotional abuse, Mr. Speaker, and the kind of embarrassment in front of one's peers that teachers are forced to resort to now is worse than physical violence, Mr. Speaker. We believe that because teachers don't have recourse to the paddle, Mr. Speaker, they're forced to use much more insidious means, Mr. Speaker, which more fundamentally undermine the confidence of these children. We believe that this will be better at preserving the relationship between the teacher and the student, Mr. Speaker, which is not one between friends, but between discipliner and student. Thank you very much.
We thank the Prime Minister for his speech.
Mr. Speaker, our stance on Hardhouse University of Toronto is this. Even if corporal punishment is legal in the private sphere, we think it's fundamentally wrong for the state to take away the choice of parents to decide whether or not the exercise of corporal punishment should be used. And that is what we're arguing on this side of the House today, Mr. Speaker. Because what this debate actually boils down to, that's something that's been fundamentally missed by Ottawa law, is what exactly is the role of the education system as a locus parentis. Because we have to realize that what they are doing is fulfilling a surrogate role of parents. However, that role that they're fulfilling is not an absolute one. And what we have to realize is that there are limits on the obligations of schools to substitute that role of parents, and therefore a limit on the rights of schools in order to fulfill those obligations. And we feel they have not shown us how the use of corporal punishment is absolutely necessary to maintain order in the schools. Because as long as there's an easier way to do it, Mr. Speaker, side government is going to fail. What we're going to give you is three arguments in my speech. I'm going to talk to you about the problem of state involvement. We're then going to talk to you about why parents are not going to be impressed. And finally, how do you deal with the problem children and who are the problem children? So let's talk about this idea of the problem of the state. What we're going to tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that teachers are not trained and should not be trained to know when corporal punishment is appropriate and inappropriate punishment, Mr. Speaker. We think they fundamentally lack the expertise to say when it's right to say that physical abuse is going to be what's the reason or capability of dealing with children. No, thank you. Furthermore, it's actually invasive into the private sphere of parenting. because what we have to realize is that the decision and discretion of whether or not to spank a child is fundamentally a private one. It's the choice of the parents, and we think that the state should not intervene and remove the choice of that parent. Eric.
But won't you concede, Mikey, that mandatory state education is by its nature an interference with parenting rights?
That's great, Eric. But what you have to realize is that it doesn't then give them a right to fulfill all the options that parents have. It does not give them the right to say, hey, we're going to change our children's religion. Hey, we're going to change our children's way of life. The two don't associate with each other. What you have to show you is why it is fundamentally necessary for the school to take on this obligation as a locus parentis. They haven't done it yet. And that's why we want to now talk about the issue of the parents. That in most Western liberal societies, that the parents are in fact the rights bearer and the rights protector for children. But we think that's fundamentally important on this side of the house, that you have to realize that it's the parents who should have that choice. We say that the state should only intervene when there is an issue of harm. And we're going to suggest that not spanking the children is not exactly a harm that the state should prevent. So therefore, we say the state should not be intervening in this respect. But why would parents have a problem with this? And one is respecting the fundamental dignity of these children, Mr. Speaker. And the dignity of these children is something that's fundamentally important in this round. The first is an issue of self-worth and self-esteem. Because we heard a lot from side government about this notion that if we take them to a private room, that's somehow going to solve all the issues of esteem. Well, first of all, Mr. Speaker, we think there is something, an issue of the issue of physical abuse. In that, why is it that the law is going to say that no one should be assaulted unless you are a child between the age of 4 and 12, and all of a sudden, the state has a right to use force on you, Mr. Speaker. That fundamentally reduces the self-worth and dignity of children. Moreover, Mr. Speaker, we think there is going to be a reputation associated with the spanking room. We don't think that they've actually dealt with any of the emotional abuse issues from the first government. Second of all, we are talking about the idea of indoctrinating a culture of violence. In fact, that's the culture with which Ottawa is actually debating this round, because they presume that the only way to deal with problem children is the use of violence. The problem with that is that the children they have pointed us out to, like the child threatening to kill his teacher with a fake arm, they're not going to be deterred by a pad to the bottom, Mr. Speaker. We think that the use of a paddle isn't going to stop a child from pointing a gun at their teachers, Mr. Speaker. If that is the issue of children in schools, Mr. Speaker, tougher issues are going to have to be made, Mr. Speaker, and that paddling just won't do. So how do you deal with problem children, Mr. Speaker? Because we've noticed a trend in education systems to look at the emotional and psychological well-being of the children, Mr. Speaker. If you want to talk about the inner-city schools, Mr. Speaker, in the United Kingdom, most inner-city schools now hire behavioral psychologists, Mr. Speaker, to make sure that these problems are dealt with from the get-go. We think that's a much better way of doing it, Mr. Speaker, than a retroactive system where you decide to solve all your problems with pitting children. Furthermore, Mr. Speaker, we have to realize that there are underlying reasons, sometimes behavioral, sometimes chemical, for these children acting up, Mr. Speaker. By allowing the provision of paddling to deal with this issue, Mr. Speaker, you don't recognize these underlying causes, Mr. Speaker. That's why you had, back when we had paddling in the first place, Mr. Speaker, there was no such thing as issues of attention deficit disorder. There were no such thing as issues of broken homes, Mr. Speaker. The solution was, and always would be, a paddling. And we think that's fundamentally problematic to the growth of children and the education of children. No thank you. What did we hear from Jamie today? We heard about this idea of there's a growing classroom size. Fine, Mr. Speaker, lower the sizes of classrooms. In fact, all this does, by using the institution of spanking, Mr. Speaker, allows the government an excuse in just being more irresponsible towards funding of the state. We think that's fundamentally problematic. You talk about the fact that there's violence against teachers, Mr. Speaker. First of all, I think most violence against teachers aren't the children under the age of 12. You aren't talking to the violence, Mr. Speaker, those are people who are over the age of 12. Furthermore, if they're that violent, they're not going to be deterred by a paddling. We then heard about the psychology of punishment. Talk about reward versus punishment, Mr. Speaker. But let's review their case plan. You have to call the spanker into the room. You need to then possibly book an appointment in the spanking room, especially if you're dealing with the most problem schools. And then they have to probably form a queue and they get spanked, Mr. Speaker. We think from that perspective, there definitely isn't an idea of instant punishment, Mr. Speaker. First of all, children aren't dogs. We find it fundamentally offensive to use a model of Pavlov to say that's how they should be treated, Mr. Speaker. We think they are responsible and intelligent creatures and human beings, Mr. Speaker. In fact, their fundamental pretense behind this is the very enabling issue of dignity that they're taking away from these children. We steadily crowd in opposition.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Hi, Mom. In this postmodernist world, ladies and gentlemen, we have found, or we have learned to realize, that sometimes what were traditional values and traditional practices, although they were deconstructed in the 1960s and 70s, in fact have tremendous value and tremendous pragmatic common sense. And what we in First Proposition deeply feel, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is one instance where that is the case. Corporal punishment has been used by parents and by educational institutions, ladies and gentlemen, for thousands of years. And I think it's a bit disingenuous for First Opposition to stand up here and say that it doesn't work. Because, ladies and gentlemen, a social and cultural institution such as that does not perpetuate itself over millennia if it doesn't actually have some kind of benefit. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Dara stood up on a point of information, and he told us, we think that the fact that there's not enough money to hire enough teachers, ladies and gentlemen, isn't an argument to sanction state violence, ladies and gentlemen. And I'll deal with the sanctioning of state violence in a moment, ladies and gentlemen, but I simply have to say I disagree with him. Because I think that the added cost, ladies and gentlemen, of hiring more teachers can possibly be a social burden. I think that sometimes you have to make a value judgment, and because we believe that corporal punishment isn't as offensive as they do, because we believe that it's perfectly reasonable, we don't have a problem with the cost. So thank you, sit down. Now I'm going to talk to you, ladies and gentlemen, about a legal analysis of the situation. I'm going to analyze the teacher's legal relationship to the child, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to talk to you about the legal situation of children themselves, and why it is that they have a lower rights threshold than everybody else in society. But before I do that, I'd like to look at some of the things that Mikey said in his speech. Now the first thing that he said, ladies and gentlemen, is that even if it's legal in the private sphere, we think that it's wrong to take away a parent's right to choice. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we take away a parent's right to choice to teach their children about such fundamental things as sex education, ladies and gentlemen. We take away the right to choice to teach them at all, or to not teach them at all, ladies and gentlemen, because education is compulsory. Either you send them to school, ladies and gentlemen, or you homeschool them, but we do not give parents the option not to educate their children. We believe, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a situation where we do have the right to restrict the rights of parents, ladies and gentlemen, if it's necessary to the proper functioning of an educational institution. No, thank you, sit down. Mikey talked to us about the problem of state involvement, and he tells us that teachers aren't trained to be able to decide when it is to administer this punishment and when it's not proper, ladies and gentlemen. I think this is a bit ridiculous. When do parents receive training in deciding when it is it's right to spank their children, ladies and gentlemen? More to the point, teachers administer emotionally traumatic sanctions all the time, ladies and gentlemen, when they give students bad grades, when they browbeat them emotionally in front of the class and yell at them, ladies and gentlemen. They receive training at that at Teachers College. We think that they can receive proper training as to when to administer corporal punishment. They told us that we have to show you the need as to why this is necessary. Maybe he wasn't listening to the part of Jamie's speech where Jamie outlined all of the evidence of growing violence in school and of growing social dysfunction in school and about the need for a reserved punishment, ladies and gentlemen. Because we don't think that expelling children and bouncing them from school to school to school is necessarily the most beneficial thing for those children. We think that if you can modify their behavior, ladies and gentlemen, through corporal punishment and keep them in one single institution and afford them that kind of stability, ladies and gentlemen, you will in fact have a better chance of correcting their emotional and behavioral problems than if you bounce them around from schools but preserve their dignity. Yes?
Can you give me an example of a child between the ages of 4 and 12 who has tried to kill its teacher or threatened to kill its teacher? And moreover, how are you going to pay for all these extra medical staff that you're going to need to monitor everything if you think employing a couple more teachers is too expensive?
Okay, maybe your school didn't have a school nurse, but mine did. That constitutes medical staff in my view, Dara. That's a bit silly, but if you want an example of somebody of a child between the ages of 4 and 12 bringing guns to school, I watched Bowling for Columbine. I'm pretty sure everybody in this room watched Bowling for Columbine, where there was a little black boy who brought a gun to school and killed a 6-year-old girl. Ladies and gentlemen, the problem of violence for children between the ages of 4 and 12 is very serious indeed, and I don't think it's acceptable for them to simply downplay it that way. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Mikey tells us that parents won't like it because it's an erosion of fundamental dignity, ladies and gentlemen. Well, first of all, we tell you that children have a lower rights threshold in the first place. We coerce them in all kinds of ways that we don't coerce adults, ladies and gentlemen, because we recognize that it's necessary in order to instill the values in children that will make them functional adults to reduce their dignity, ladies and gentlemen, in order that they learn those proper lessons. Now, we're not saying that every time a child does something wrong that you should spank them, ladies and gentlemen, but we think that maintaining that option is absolutely necessary, because like it or not, the fact of the matter is that there are some people for whom lowering their grades or yelling at them in class won't make them care. But nobody likes physical pain, ladies and gentlemen, and that is why this will be effective. Mikey tells us, ladies and gentlemen, how is it that you deal with a problem with children, or how do you deal with problem children, rather? And he tells us that this won't solve the problem of a student holding a gun at his teacher's head. I dare say, Mikey, I don't really think that's the kind of violence that we were discussing. We're talking about students running up and trying to beat up their teachers, ladies and gentlemen. We think that we need to deal with that behavior in a very serious fashion. Now, the last thing that Mikey talked to us about was this idea of behavioral psychologists, and there are better methods with which to deal with behavioral problems in children, ladies and gentlemen, and I fundamentally deny that analysis. Why is it, ladies and gentlemen? Because in criminal law, we accept that sometimes the use of violence is necessary to buttress social norms and to punish individuals and to deter them from further actions of those kinds, ladies and gentlemen. So even though, yes, we should talk to people and encourage them to behave properly, ladies and gentlemen, sometimes they don't. We do it for adults, ladies and gentlemen, and I think that we should do it for children as well. Now, we don't send children under the age of 12 to prison, ladies and gentlemen, because they're not morally responsible, but for the same reason, ladies and gentlemen, they're not capable of reasoning morally properly and understanding that their action is wrong, and we need a means of being able to demonstrate that to them. Now, let's look at the legal situation, ladies and gentlemen. Now, we see that in schools, teachers are actually subrogated in many of the rights of parents. For instance, if there's a medical emergency, a teacher actually has the right to consent to medical treatment if the parents cannot be reached, ladies and gentlemen. We see that there's an analogy in the legal situation between parents and teachers, ladies and gentlemen, in the institution, because teachers actually take over a huge part of the function of parents while the child is at school. And so we don't think it's a stretch to extend the legal rights of parents to corporal punishment to teachers. More to the point, ladies and gentlemen, if a student engages in damaging behavior, kills somebody or hurts or damages property, ladies and gentlemen, the teacher under whose care that child is will be held legally responsible for that behavior. We think morally, ladies and gentlemen, if we're going to hold teachers responsible for the behavior of children under their care, that you should also afford them all the means possible in order to control that child's behavior and limit the damage possible. Thirdly, ladies and gentlemen, with regards to children, we see that children have a lower rights threshold. We don't allow them to consent to large purchases, ladies and gentlemen. We don't allow them to consent to medical treatment, and we don't allow them to make a decision about whether or not to go to school. Because I know when I was 8 years old, I probably wouldn't have chosen to go to school, but I'm very glad I did, because otherwise I wouldn't be here debating the world's fine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I'd like to talk to you about today, and what I'd like to start with, is something that Eric said just before he sat down. Eric got up here and said, we don't allow children to make a lot of decisions for themselves because they're just too young. And on side opposition, what we have consistently told you is we don't allow children to make those choices. We allow parents to make those choices. There are certain absolute goods that our society recognizes that all children need, like they need an education. But we do allow the parent to choose a private school versus a public school versus homeschooling for their children because the parents should have that input and do have that input into how their children are raised. What we have heard from side government, the case they have given us, only works if you accept that spanking is an absolute good, that it can always work, that it can always be done effectively, that there is no gray area. Most of society would accept that education is an absolute good for children. Very few people in society, even the ones who like spanking themselves, would suggest that it's an absolute good for everyone, and yes, I know what I just said. Mr. Speaker, what I'd like to do is talk to you about the behavior in these children that we've heard about from side proposition, because I think they have missed the point, and I think it's very telling that they've missed the point, because that's what their case encourages people to do. No, thank you, I'm just getting started. So let's talk about what kind of misbehavior we're discussing. Because they got up on side proposition and said children are bringing guns to school, children are threatening to kill their teachers, and then they said, oh, but that's not behavior we'd be correcting with this, because obviously it won't work. And we'd say yes on side opposition, obviously that won't work. These children have other issues. It's not simply, I don't respect my teacher enough because they can paddle me one day, and by the way, if it's not the teacher doing it, I'm not sure the respect is transferred to the teacher. But what they are saying is that there's some kind of mild misbehavior that can be corrected. directed, and their example are guns in schools, we say that's just silly. We're going to say there are two things that generally cause the kind of psychological problems that they are talking about, the deep-seated violent acts of children. They are, first of all, deep-seated psychological problems, and second of all, problems at home. Their example of the child who brought a gun to school was not that the child brought the gun to school because they didn't like their teacher and didn't like the grade they got. The child brought the gun to school, for anyone who's seen the movie, because their family at home had guns sitting around and the child was curious about the gun. That has nothing to do with respect for the teachers. That's an issue about gun control, and we think that's an entirely separate debate. What we are going to say is what their case does in a second is allow you to gloss over these underlying issues. It allows you to say, if we battle the child, it'll all be all right. We don't have to look at whether they have a chemical imbalance in their brain. We don't have to look at whether or not they were beaten at home. All we have to do is give them a smack and they'll be all right.
Well, I'm sorry to have to remind you that the gun was a fake one, which is significant, but what about the children who beat up the teachers? They don't use weapons, but...
Any child who is under 12 years of age and can beat up their teacher is not a child I would like to meet in a dark alley. Intimidation of teachers. You were talking about behavioral issues that generally stem from something in their home life because they haven't learned to disrespect authority yet, because they're too busy getting screwed up at home, or because of problems, imbalances in the chemical composition of the brain. Their plan means you can entirely gloss over that. We think that's fundamentally problematic. What did we hear from Eric? Because he was almost as silly as Jamie was, and I'll be getting to Jamie in just a second. Eric got up here and told us corporal punishment has been around a really long time, so obviously it has to work. What we are going to say on side opposition is just because something was around a really long time doesn't mean that it works. It means we hadn't found something better yet. Now we have, guys. Now we have behavioral specialists in schools. Now we have psychological profiles. We have counselors talking to children. We have nurses there to assess whether or not they were abused at home. We have all of these safeguards there so that we can find other ways to treat these children. We can put them in other programs that will suit their needs so we don't gloss over it with a smack of the paddle. Furthermore, what we would say is, even if you're willing to accept that it can be effective in some cases, we're going to say that it's not absolutely necessary, so it should be the parent's choice, and that even if it's effective in some cases, there is no way for teachers to have an absolute rule of when it will be effective and how it will help this single child. That has to be the parent's choice, because it is not just an accepted good that if you spank a child, good things will happen. The second thing that we heard from Eric is that criminal law sometimes requires violence. And we think that this is a very silly argument because our entire opposition in Mike's speech was predicated on the idea that it's not the action that's important, it's who's delivering the action. It's one thing to have a judicial system that delivers actions because we've, as citizens in the social contract, signed over our rights to a government and said you can do that. Parents have not done that in an absolute fashion with their children. What parents have done is said that there are certain things that we are going to allow you to do, like teach our children, like check if they have bruises, like monitor them at lunchtime. What they have not done is said it is absolute that you can go ahead and use whatever force you feel necessary on my child. That is still within the purveyance of parenting to make that decision. There is no way to train teachers to know whether or not it's effective because there is no absolute effectiveness. It's your belief of whether or not corporal punishment is effective. That's why it should be the parent's choice.
But ma'am, under a codified, clear system where everybody knows the rules, everybody knows what's going to happen if you do something...
Okay, this is just ridiculous. Under the current system, we don't have a system where you already know exactly what action results in what. Different actions have different levels of severity. Different teachers believe in different methods. There is no way to have a clear and predictable system that's What did we actually hear from Mike today? Because I think it got ignored in large part. We talked to you about the idea of a locus parenti, that you have to give some rights to teachers, but you don't sign over carte blanche, all control over your children. And they said, well, we remove choice in some cases, like sex education. We would say, first of all, in a lot of places, children can sit out those classes on the request of their parents. What we also say is the idea that you need to give children some level of education about sexual health is a more universally accepted good than if you spank them, they will suddenly behave. The second thing that Mike talked to you about is the idea that teachers just aren't trained to know this, that it is invasive into the private sphere of parenting, and that because there is no one right way, you have to leave the choice in the hands of the parents, and we really heard no response on that side of the house. The final thing he talked to you about is that there are very real reasons that parents can and should object to this. We talked to you about the dignity of children, and their only response was, children don't reason morally the same way. We would say, just because you're younger doesn't mean you're a different species. You can be taught to reason morally the same way. Doesn't mean you have to smack them around. We told you there are other options, like behavioral specialists, like special programs. For all of these reasons, we beg to oppose.
Because you've tried to set up a burden on us which is just unreasonable. You said that we have to prove there's an absolute good to smacking. We say no. If you want us to prove that, prove to us why there's an absolute good to the punishments that are already inflicted on children in schools today. First of all, we say things like having snide comments by teachers trying to kind of get people psychologically are just as harmful as being smacked. It's just not so obvious. But secondly, and more dangerously, we say what teachers do when they have no recourse and don't feel they're empowered to be able to deal with difficult children is just ignore them. They put them in a corner and they don't deal with them. And what that does, ladies and gentlemen, in the long term is lead to those children being dissatisfied with authority figures, dissatisfied with the education system, and not give them a route out of their current difficulties. We say that's not an absolute good, and we don't think we have to prove any more. Now, what am I going to do for you today, ladies and gentlemen? I'm going to show you why we think the in loco parentis model of handing over rights falls on our side, and why you have a burden to prove why this right shouldn't be handed over along with all of the others. Secondly, I'm going to show to you why we actually think parents are really gagging for a big smacking of their children, and why we think they love it. And then I'm going to show you why we think actually it's great for teachers and for the punishments that they can hand out. But before I do that, let's just have a quick think about some of the points and show you how I'm going to deal in rebuttal in later on in the case. Because they said that it was just about kind of glossing over it, be an easy, quick hit, and that you wouldn't have a codified system. Rubbish. Under the proposition model, we had nurses, we had reports, we had different teachers being brought in. We think that's bloody codified, and we think that means that it's going to be pretty clear what you have to do in order to get in there. At the moment, because there aren't all these checks and balances in the system, we don't think there's a codified system. That's why we're changing it. Now, let's also look, ladies and gentlemen, at the idea that under 12s are just irrelevant to the debate. First of all, we say there are some rather nasty under 12s. I was beaten up as an 11-year-old. It wasn't nice. But also, we say it's really important in those formative years to have a system which makes respect for authority figures absolutely crucial. That's why 4 to 12 is critical. That's why you can't just wipe it out of the debate as Hart House have attempted to do. That's why they're going to lose. Let's move on now to the extension. Sorry, guys. Look, first of all, we think at the moment we have a system where parents are given the legal right to smack their children. They're given the ability to authorise short, sharp smackings. The European Court of Human Rights has said that's okay, as has the US Supreme Court. We think that's another right, along with the others that we already give to them. You have to show us, given that they are legally responsible on school trips, legally responsible in fire situations, legally responsible for bullying causes, and can be sued for all of those things, why we don't hand over those rights as well. And the only thing they come up with is, well, parents might not like it. And I'm going to show you why actually parents will really like it. But before I do, Darren.
Well, actually, in reality, that's not true. We don't give teachers rights over the corporal integrity of the child, unless there is an instance where neither of the parents think the parents can be contacted. Why aren't you allowing the same system to be in place in this instance?
No, we do actually, Derek, because what we say is that you can take children to hospital and have them given to A&E if they break their arm or something like that. We say that the corporal integrity of those children is being protected by the parents, and equally, they can be sued if they don't fulfil their obligation to look after them in a fire situation, or, as has been in the case in the United Kingdom recently, where a teacher was sued for not looking after a child who died after alcohol abuse on a school trip. We say those sorts of things show where teachers are put in loco parentis, and we do think the right is transferred. But no, thank you. Let's look right now at how this is actually something that parents want. Because we say, for the parents of pupils who have brilliantly well-behaved children, they're not going to care because their children won't be smacked. But they do care, and they're calling out for it at the moment, because disruptive children in those classes are stopping their children having a fair and free sort of education. No, thank you. So they want those children expelled at the moment. We say, and as I'm going to show you later, expulsion isn't a great idea, and we don't think that's a great solution for those children, but any sort of punishment that deals with disruptive pupils is something that the parents of good children are going to want. What about the parents of the children that end up going to be smacked? Firstly, we say that in many cases, they give this sort of punishment at home anyway. They don't think it's great that their position as an authority figure, that means no Dara, if those position as an authority figure in that child's life is being undermined by their ability for 8 or 10 hours a day for them to be able to get away with murder, sometimes quite literally. We don't think that actually those parents are going to complain. We think they're actually calling out for it. But secondly, in the cases where those parents don't have control over their children at home, we say they're calling out for the school to take a leadership level and to provide the sorts of discipline and provide the sorts of moral guidance that we don't think those parents can do themselves. And often it's the case that parents themselves are the ones that are being blamed for not providing the sort of home environment that provides those sorts of level of stability and that provides those sort of level of leadership and discipline. And we think actually those sorts of parents are going to be okay with having their children put in a position where they are being punished under a clear codified system with lots of nurses there to kind of hold their hands afterwards and everything else, and we think it is going to be something that they're going to be in favour of. No, thank you. Let's move on to why teachers are going to love it too. We say at the moment that teachers are afraid of touching pupils. Firstly, because they think they're going to be sued, and secondly, because there's actually a culture of pupils being more aggressive towards their teachers. We say, look at the cases in the United States and California where security guards have been implemented and put into schools. Look at the cases in the UK this year where a teacher in Pimlico was raped by one of her children. We say, also look at the idea again in the UK where we've had teachers stabbed by other people. We say, yes, they may not be the 4 to 12-year-olds in every case, but the problem is that the idea of an authority figure in a classroom is something that has been undermined at that stage in their educational career. Pupils at the moment are able to get away with things because teachers will not confront them, A, because they're worried about being sued, and B, because they've been beaten into submission by aggressive and difficult children. We say this is a way to redress that balance and make them actually have more sorts of power in the classroom. And we say at the moment the only recourse you have is 1,000 lines of "I will not be bad." That might be enough for Dara to behave, it's certainly not for Alex. We say that otherwise all you have between that level and the other is expulsion. They've already proved to you why expulsion is bad because of truancy levels, because of drug addictions, because of going into levels of kind of petty crime. Look at the difference between Singapore and the United Kingdom. Singapore has this model, has low truancy rates because people are dealt with within the system. They have this codified system, they have to go to a nurse, their issues are being talked out under, and teachers have to find out why they're behaving like this. We say, at the moment, teachers don't have a middle ground option. They don't have a way of exerting authority. Yes, it might not be them, but it's any authority figure. And we say, teachers want it, parents want it, and bloody hell, the school children are going to have to deal with it.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen. Now, my partner's told me that I can't waste the first minute of my speech telling jokes, so I'm not going to. But what I will say is, terima kasih tuan-tuan dan puan-puan. Which I thought would mean nothing to the audience, but I've been reliably informed will be hysterical, or rather my pronunciation will be, to the audience watching at home. What Cambridge is going to do to you, for you today, ladies and gentlemen, not to you, that's the proposition. What we're going to do for you is 4 things. We're going to look at the effects of reinforcing the impression in children that violence is a legitimate solution to problems. Looking at the likely effects that this will have in the playground, and also looking at the likely effects that this will have in society. Secondly, I'll look at how children's rights should not be treated less than adults' rights. Thirdly, I'll be looking at the fact that misbehaving children often have problems at home. These problems often involve violence, and exacerbating and perpetuating this cycle of violence is precisely not what the school should be doing. And lastly, I'll be looking at the idea that disciplining children by violence is merely an excuse for bad teaching and failing to engage a classroom. But firstly, I want to pick up a few points of rebuttal. Firstly, the Ottawa case was very legalistic, and I assert that it was very legalistic for a reason. They were worried about abuse, and they were worried about litigation as a result of abuse. And we contend that they were very right to be worried about litigation from abuse, because there's a very fine line between the permanent damage that Ottawa ruled out as a legitimate punishment, and all other punishments leading up to, but not including permanent damage, that apparently is okay. Moreover, there was no proportionality in the model that they gave to you today, ladies and gentlemen. So presumably, beating a child black and blue, but not permanently so, is okay, and we weren't given any paradigms or parameters to tell us, how much punishment was legitimate. We say that was slack and bad. Go.
Okay, it works in Singapore, the model's going to be fine.
Well, I hadn't realised that Jamie and Eric had written the legislation in Singapore, but what we say, ladies and gentlemen, quite uncontroversially, is there are going to be problem cases when you allow teachers or non-teachers to abuse children by beating them, and we say that parents, especially given the fact that they're not given the chance to educate their children outside the public sector because the private sector leads too, that this is going to lead, inevitably, to litigation. Secondly, ladies and gentlemen, this idea that there is no recourse but violence to deal with violent pupils. We say that there certainly is recourse, that's exclusion, expulsion, and the variety of special measures and special teaching that can be done for these children. Now, we accept that there perhaps, in many countries around the world, there is an increase in violence. What we contend is that people aren't using the measures available and implementing them effectively enough. We believe that there is an obligation to try these non-violent measures and implement them successfully first, and moreover, learn from the best practice of countries which do not have corporal punishment in schools, but do not have the similar rising crime in violence in classrooms that you see in those countries where it happens, and we should be learning from those countries rather than taking this regressive step back into the Victorian times. And lastly, this idea about abuse. Now, what we say, ladies and gentlemen, is that yes, there is permanent physical abuse, but there's also permanent psychological abuse. And this was something that wasn't addressed in the first proposition, or indeed the second proposition speeches. And I'll be getting to that in point 3. But first of all, point 1. We say that this form of corporal punishment is going to reinforce the impression within children that violence is a legitimate solution to problems in society. We say that's going to lead very likely to more violence in the playground, but moreover, especially when the ages that Jamie and Eric picked, between the ages of 4 and 12, where the internalisation of social norms is that much more significant and that much more thoroughly done, we say that this is going to be an ingrained lesson on those 4 to 12-year-olds. So not only have Jamie and Eric left out those people over the age of 12 who are going to be big enough and more likely enough to cause the problems for the teachers with violence and not going to be able to use violence, even if it's effective, as they say, ladies and gentlemen, it's also going to create the impression between these new generation of 4 and 12-year-olds that violence is a legitimate solution to their problems. So it's more than likely, ladies and gentlemen, that these children, who, let's face it, the reason that they use violence is because they don't understand the distinction between right and wrong. So by muddying the waters and punishing them for it that way, by a figure of authority as the punisher would be, we say, ladies and gentlemen, that this merely makes matters worse for those children. So let's go to point number 2. We say that children do not have fewer rights than adults, and do not have less significant rights than adults. There was this idea of medicine. Well, we think, ladies and gentlemen, it's a no-brainer. The decision to give children treatment to fix their bodies is obviously different to the decision to actually hurt those bodies anyway. But moreover, parents are the people who have to be given the right to consent to that treatment, and teachers are not given that right under the status quo, except where the parent is contacted. And under their model, we're not just not going to contact the parents, we're not going to give them the right to refuse this treatment of their children. So thirdly, this idea that misbehaving children have other problems, and often their misbehaviour stems from abuse in the home. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that if a child is being abused in the home, if a child, moreover, is misbehaving, the teacher ought firstly to ask the question, why is the child misbehaving? We say it's not because the child is bad in any objective sense, it's because things have happened to him, or he's not being engaged in the classroom, or he's being abused in the home, especially if he's externalising the behaviour that he's been given at home and taking it out on children. We say these children, these violent bullies, need help. They don't need to be beaten on the backside by the punishers of Eric and Jamie. Lastly, we have this idea that poor discipline in school classrooms is often the result of a failure to engage pupils. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that teachers should take responsibility for engaging children, should take responsibility for the way that they deal with their children, and shouldn't just rely as a last resort, or even as a first resort, because Jamie and Eric didn't actually have any criteria for investigating the decision to punish in the first place, so we don't actually know under what circumstances teachers are going to have recourse to this punishment mechanism. We say, ladies and gentlemen, that this is a very dangerous, a very regressive, and indeed a very violent response to a problem that we do not believe has been satisfactorily addressed at the moment, if indeed you do have countries in which you do see a rise in student crime. And we say, ladies and gentlemen, that the best way to deal with that in those countries is to learn from the example of countries where you do not beat children, you do not have state-sanctioned child abuse, and you try to deal with it that way. That, ladies and gentlemen, is the opposition to this case. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, I feel slightly like I'm on a game show set here at the moment, and the opposites here kind of vying to win a holiday with Ottawa law to an exotic location somewhere. What I am going to prove to you in this big debate that we've had today is that the proposition have absolutely and utterly spanked the opposition. We've spanked them rotten. We've spanked them rotten for three main reasons. We've won this debate, firstly, Mr. Chairman, because we've shown that there is a problem in schools with the status quo. Secondly, we've shown us that, in fact, parents shouldn't have absolute choice over what happens to their kids in schools, because loco parentis does extend to the extent that teachers should be allowed to exercise corporal punishment under a fully codified and clear system. And thirdly, we've showed you that fundamentally we do believe that a controlled and codified corporal punishment system, which is what is being proposed, works in terms of dealing with the problems in schools which were identified straight out by the first top team. But before I do any of that, I'd like to deal with a few of the things that Joe said in his speech. And he told us that firstly, what we were going to do through our model was to completely legitimise all forms of violence, to tell children that summary beatings were okay, and that somehow summary beatings would take place, that you'd go into the beating room for half an hour until you were kind of bleeding out of every pore, no thank you, you couldn't see, and the children had to be taken to hospital by the medic and wouldn't be able to go back to school until they were old enough to know better. We say, no, that's not how this system works. We say that because you have a codified system, as in Singapore and as in other countries, no thank you, the parameters are clear. No thank you, sir. People actually know that there are other measures that happen before they get corporal punishment actually attributed to them. What they've asserted right the way down that bench, no thank you, is that if you drop your pencil in the middle of an exam, you're going to be hit with a ruler or a stick. That's not what's happening. What you have in Singapore is a system, no thank you, where you have punishments which go up on a scale, and the last resort, well, the resort after you've had meetings with your parents, meetings with educational psychologists and counsellors, no thank you, and you've done the detentions time and time again, then corporal punishment is put into play. They've misrepresented the model fundamentally, no thank you. And what they've also done is told us that children's rights shouldn't be less than adults' rights. Well, we say that's just nonsense, because children are the care of the adults who are looking after them. No, thank you. We don't let children drive cars. We don't let children go and buy alcohol, although some clearly seem to do. And I might be guilty of that myself. No, thank you. But what we say is that in terms of psychological abuse, what we've said is that if a teacher stands up and says, Joe's a nerd, look at Joe, he's a big nerd, nerdy, nerdy, nerd, that's not actually very nice for Joe. Now, I felt really bad doing that now. No, thank you. Imagine the effect on the child under the status quo, who that sort of retributive punishment where they're simply mocked goes through. And I'll be nice to Joe and take him on it. Yes, please.
If a child is abused and beaten at home, and then goes beats the child in the classroom, is it going to help that child to beat him at school?
Right, now this is an interesting point, Joe, to do with actually finding out problems of abuse in the home. And this is the next point that I was going to bring up. Because what we say is that if the schools are actually responsible for corporal punishment, they're going to know whether or not the child's being beaten in the first place. So if they find them coming into school with massive welts on their back and huge pole-shaped bruises down their legs, no thank you, then they're going to know that that's come from an external source, and it's not been the slap on the wrist which would be under our current model. Furthermore, to add to that, we say that because psychologists and educational psychologists and counsellors are always being employed under our model to ensure that the children don't have negative long-term effects from the actual thing that takes place, no thank you, Darren, then we say, again, this falls on that side of the house. And finally, this idea that corporal punishment was just an excuse for bad teachers. Well, we say no. Currently, lines and detentions are excuses for bad teachers, and currently under the status quo, teachers being able to just say, little Jimmy, go and sit in the corner, no thank you, wear the dunce's hat and turn away from the rest of the class, I don't want to talk to you anymore, is fundamentally not the right thing to do. But let's look at where the clashes lay. No, thank you, ma'am. Firstly, we've told you that there are limited current options with the status quo, that the lines and the yelling, and the fact that we just have too much disruption, which isn't being dealt by the current measures which we have, means we have to take this next step. Now, we admit that it might be regressive, that it might look like we're going back a bit in terms of our educational philosophy, but fundamentally we say that because expulsion at the moment is far too easy, and teachers are just able to say, I don't like that child, let's alienate them completely, let's kick them out of the school altogether, we don't actually think that that's any better than ensuring they learn what's right from and wrong in a corporal punishment situation. And I'll take you, ma'am.
Okay, the question of whether or not to spank a child is not one of efficacy, but a moral choice. When we have a movement towards more behavioural treatments, why would you regress this, especially with
thank you, ma'am. So we understand now that you're putting a moral argument forward, and we say that this leads us on to the next point, which is really to do with whether or not it's morally legitimate and legally legitimate for parents to give their rights to the control of their children over to teachers. And we say that fundamentally it is an absolute transfer of this loco-parental status. Because if you look at the fact that teachers can currently be sued because of negligence, or the fact that teachers currently have a responsibility in circumstances where a medical emergency arises, no thank you, and Dara's right, where the parents cannot be contacted, then that means that also extends to corporal punishment. Because essentially what Dara is saying is that every time little Jimmy is bad in the classroom, the teacher has to get on the phone to mum and dad, get them into the room, and then make the parents deal with the child in the classroom. That's no way to deal with discipline, no thank you. And it's certainly no way at all if you have a codified and clear system, which we believe the parents will be happy with anyway, working in an absolutely no thank you, straightforward manner. Now, we then had this question about the dignity of children, whether or not it was legitimate fundamentally to smack children. Well, we say to that, look at the anti-smacking legislation, which has been passed in my own country of Scotland. Now there, it allows my mother to reasonably chastise me if I do something wrong, but those laws are being tightened up to ensure that it's just a slap of the wrist, and not the former system, which allowed her to beat me black and blue, which explains why I am the way I am today. But what we say fundamentally, and more importantly, Mr. Chairman, is that the idea that in the social contract fear and liberty have to be completely separated is wrong. Because in terms of authority, and in terms of ensuring that the children in the classroom actually understand what the rules of the game are, no thank you, we do need to have a situation where smacking is applied. And this quickly leads me on to why it does work. Because we've proven to you that we don't have to have an absolute good in terms of smacking. We don't have to say that in every circumstance it's going to change the behaviour. What we say is that in a majority of circumstances it will. And that currently, unless they're willing to prove an absolute good to all the lines and the shouting and the yelling, then they can't win this debate. Furthermore, we say that because 4 to 12-year-olds do have a different moral code, they do need to be told about authority from an early age. They don't understand complex reasoning, and they do sometimes just need to be taken to one side and told why the action which they've done is wrong and has led to them being smacked, and why that will have a long-term benefit. It is something which can work. Finally, on the point of long-term damage, if that opposition argument stands, that would mean that a significant proportion, potentially of the people in this room, who were educated in the 1960s, would be walking zombies, complete wrecks, who didn't have any sort of psychological makeup whatsoever which allowed them to be productive members of society. We've seen that it has worked in the past, that the people aren't emotionally crippled. We've seen that it can work. So because it's good for children, because it's good for parents when they actually want it, and because it will in the long term also be good for teachers and the educational system as a whole, Team Oxford win the holiday, Team Oxford win the car.
Gentlemen, Oxford can have the car and they can have the holiday. I just want that over there. Ladies and gentlemen, Team Oxford seem to think that there's a problem in our model because teachers use detention as an excuse to punish children they don't like. Under their model, they just use beating. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, that that sort of victimization, when there is in that model no oversight on the decision taken, just on the act perpetrated, ladies and gentlemen, just is not good enough. Also, ladies and gentlemen, we had some fantastic additions to the model from Alex, like, for instance, the presence of a child psychologist who would monitor the child after the fact. Unfortunately for you, Oswald didn't add that to their model, and that was a mistake on their part. Also, ladies and gentlemen, apparently the school will know if the child is being abused, because during the strip searching process, they'll see the graphs on their backs. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, at no point in that model have they said that all kids have to get naked every day just to get to as you can see if they're being abused. Ladies and gentlemen, Alex was asked about absolute rights, and he decided that the best example he could come up with was we don't allow children to drive cars. Yeah, but we don't also allow all adults to drive cars. There is a distinction, ladies and gentlemen, between the allowance of driving a car and the allowance of not getting beaten up. We argue in a society, ladies and gentlemen, where we say hitting another adult, take a seat, because they stole something that belongs to you is wrong, ladies and gentlemen, isn't good enough to say if you can hit a child whenever you want. Because Alex misunderstood Joe's point and misrepresented Joe's point about the perpetrating effect of violence. No thank you, take a seat. Joe's point was, if you beat a child as a solution to a problem, that child will then beat other people as a solution to a problem. So the actual analogous situation is, a child in the playground steals your lollipop, so you twat him one in the face. And we think, ladies and gentlemen, that that's absolutely unacceptable.
And this is happening in a separate room, under separate people, under a code
they're not comparable to just retributive justice on the back of someone stealing your laundry.
I think the kid is going to be aware of the fact that he's getting beaten. The problem is using violence as the solution. If you are saying there's no cause and effect, no, thank you, take a seat. If you are saying there's no cause and effect between the punishment in your model and the act that's perpetrated, then you just lied to your first proposition too. Ladies and gentlemen, we would argue that in summarising this debate, there are two questions that must be answered. Take a seat. Firstly, ladies and gentlemen, and quite importantly, we think, what do parents and teachers want? And we don't think it's good enough, no thank you, for a second proposition to stand up here and say, teachers will love it, and parents will love it, and there's no analysis of that at all. And ladies and gentlemen, secondly, we'll be analysing on what will best achieve a situation of good behaviour within a school environment. Take a seat. Ladies and gentlemen, they have given us no evidence that parents would want this, but let's accept the fact that some parents, like the ones, take a seat, who beat their children up at home, will be perfectly happy to have it. The problem with their model has never been the fact that some parents won't choose that route. The problem is there is no choice for parents under their model. Their model mandates abuse of their children and mandates a sanction abuse of their children. No, thank you, take a seat. And we believe that to be unacceptable. And secondly, ladies and gentlemen, we would argue on this side of the house that actually teachers don't want it. And here's the analysis. They don't want it because they don't want to be opened up to the litigation that Joe spoke about and the litigation that they didn't rebut. They don't, ladies and gentlemen, want to be dragged through the court system by a child that says, actually, you went a little bit too far. Or a child, ladies and gentlemen, as has been the case in Britain and Ireland, who 20 years later retrospectively sues them for having beaten them a little too hard. But we believe, ladies and gentlemen, that their model just doesn't take that into account. Getting on, ladies and gentlemen, to the second plank of this case, the part about what, ladies and gentlemen, will achieve the best result. Firstly, they rubbish cause and effect between expelling somebody and somebody being punished. We don't see why the cause and effect is different in either instance. No, thank you, take a seat. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, that no, I said no to him, I'm probably not going to accept you. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason the cause and effect works in our model as well is because you expel the child and you explain to it that it's being expelled for having done something wrong. There are complaints about expulsion is, well, you know, they'll all hang out in the expelled kids club. Well, no, ladies and gentlemen, they just go to a different school. We don't prevent children from being educated just because they're poorly behaved. Then, ladies and gentlemen, this is an important distinction in their model, is the issue of 4 to 12-year-olds. And they argued on their side of the house that this was because it would create a deterrent effect. But at no point, ladies and gentlemen, did they give an example of this deterrent effect. We have, on the entire opposition bench, used the example about children who are beaten at home. Those being the children who often misbehave in school. Clearly the deterrent effect doesn't always work, ladies and gentlemen, and we argue that infringing on the corporal integrity of a human being, just because it might work in some instances, isn't good enough. No thank you, take a seat. Also, ladies and gentlemen, they gave us absolutely no negative analysis on what the benefits of excluding children are. We argue that that has as much cause and effect, no thank you, take a seat, as much cause and effect, ladies and gentlemen, and not the deleterious consequences that that side of the House have pointed out. Ladies and gentlemen, throughout the opposition case, we've talked about, firstly, what benefits children on the basis of getting them to behave better. What will make children, ladies and gentlemen, behave better within the school environment and out with the school environment. And that side of the House have fundamentally failed to deal with our counterexamples, and our counterexamples particularly on other forms of punishment. Jane.
If spanking will create the cycle of violence you suggest, why do we allow it at home? If someone steals a lollipop, we can stop them from doing that by spanking them.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, yes, sometimes we think when you beat your children at home it's not a particularly good thing. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, however, that the state gives that right to the parent, because we argue the parent knows their child better. We also argue that in the vast majority of cases where that doesn't cross the line to abuse, the parent won't be using it to victimize the children, something that side of the House is completely ignored. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, no thank you, take a seat. Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, children aren't liked by their teachers. That's what Alex spoke about. Teachers who punish their children with exclusion and punish their children with detention because they don't like them. We argue that then being allowed to beat them up isn't a particularly good solution to the problem. We argue, ladies and gentlemen, that the cycle of violence when perpetrated in schools is worse for no other reason than it's perpetrated by a third party. It's not somebody you necessarily particularly like. It's not your parent. It's not somebody who's there 24 hours a day to explain exactly why that happened to you. Ladies and gentlemen, that side of the House set themselves up a burden. Their burden has to be, their burden that they have to prove must be that infringing the corporal integrity of a human being can be justified, firstly, from the effects that it has, and we would argue they haven't displayed those, but secondly, ladies and gentlemen, that that right can be trumped in this instance, something they also haven't said. Their only example was infringing or it was providing treatment for a child. We have argued, and Joe argued, that that's different for two reasons. Firstly, because it's treatment, and that's usually not the same as beating somebody up. But secondly, ladies and gentlemen, and more importantly, because they only have that right when the parents aren't contactable. We believe that choice must rest with parents. That side of the House have taken the opposite view. We believe they are wrong to do so. Ladies and gentlemen, as Joe pointed out, this cannot be allowed to be an excuse for bad teaching. It cannot be allowed to be an excuse for bad parenting. It cannot be allowed to reinforce violence, and they must show us why those rights can be infringed, and on those grounds, I beg to oppose.
Across the floor and shake hands. That concludes the debate for tonight. I'd like to now hand over the proceedings to Naima. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Susan Thomas. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a break after this, and the ceremony would like to invite all of you, ladies and gentlemen, to a cocktail